He didn't open the barn door because he heard something. He opened it because the snow had piled so high against the latch that if he didn't clear it that night, he'd lose the whole left wall by morning. That was the only reason, a practical reason. A man like Caleb Whitmore didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble had already found him once, taken everything it wanted, and left him with nothing but 4 walls and 10,000 acres of frozen Montana ground. He yanked the door open, and the lantern light fell across a woman lying face down in the hay, one arm stretched out in front of her like she'd been reaching for something when she fell. A baby, impossibly small, impossibly quiet, was tucked against her side, wrapped in a coat that was more ice than wool. Caleb stood there. The wind screamed behind him. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he should have, and then something in his chest cracked open like frozen ground under a boot heel, and he crossed the barn in 4 steps and dropped to his knees beside them. If you've ever looked at a stranger and felt, without a single logical reason, that their life was somehow your responsibility, then you already understand what happened to Caleb Whitmore that night. And if you haven't, stay with this story, because what came next will make you ask yourself one question you won't be able to shake. What would I have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week I bring you stories just like this one, stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when everything was on the line. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that barn, but part 1. The storm had been building for 3 days. Caleb knew it the way ranchers knew things. Not from clouds or wind direction, but from the way the cattle had pressed themselves against the south fence 2 mornings before, their breath rising in white columns, their bodies tight against each other in a way that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with fear. Animals didn't lie about weather. People did. Animals never did. He'd sent his 2 ranch hands, Doyle and the kid everyone called Pockets, down to Hargrove's trading post before the first real snow hit, with instructions to stay there until the worst of it passed. He'd done it gruffly, the way he did everything. A few clipped words, a nod toward the south road, no discussion. Doyle had looked at him for a moment like he might say something and then apparently thought better of it and pulled his hat down and left. Caleb didn't need company during a storm. He never had. He'd wintered alone on this land for 4 years running, and the silence didn't bother him the way it bothered some men. Most men, actually. The men at the Hargroves post talked too much, laughed too loud, told the same 3 stories every time he was foolish enough to sit near the fire. They meant well. That was almost the most exhausting thing about them. He spent the first day of the storm in the barn reinforcing the stall walls with boards he'd had stacked in the corners since October. He spent the second day cutting and stacking wood until his shoulders ached in a way that felt clean, useful, like the pain had earned its place. He ate salt pork and day-old biscuits and went to sleep before dark. On the 3rd day, the night he opened that barn door, the temperature had dropped to something that felt personal, like the cold had a grudge. He'd already done his evening check. He was certain of that. He'd walked the barn at 6, checked each of his 12 horses, broken the ice on the water trough twice, and gone back inside. But somewhere around 9 o'clock, when the wind shifted direction with a sound like a freight train losing its brakes, he looked at the barn through the frosted window and thought about that left wall. The latch was old. He'd meant to replace it in September. He hadn't. He pulled on his coat, the heavy one, the canvas one with the wool lining, and he went out. The cold hit him like a wall. Even through the coat, he felt it in his teeth, in the bones of his face. He kept his head down and walked in a straight line, following the rope he'd strung between the house and the barn 3 winters ago precisely for nights like this. Visibility was nothing. The world was white and howling and absolutely indifferent to whether Caleb Whitmore made it to his barn or not. He made it. He wrestled with the snowpack door for nearly a minute before it gave. The lantern he'd carried, caged in his arm against the wind, threw yellow light across the hay-covered floor, across the horses shifting and snorting in their stalls, and then across her. He went still. His first thought, God help him, was that one of his horses had gotten loose and knocked something over. That was how his mind worked. Practical first, everything else second. But the shape on the floor was too small for a horse, too deliberate. She had fallen, but she had fallen trying. Her body was angled toward the back corner of the barn, where the hay was deepest and the drafts were weakest. She'd had enough sense left to aim for the warmest spot before she went down. Caleb crossed the barn and crouched beside her. She was young, maybe 25, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because cold had done something to her face, tightened it, made it severe. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise. Her hair, dark brown and loose, was matted with ice and hay. The coat tucked around her was meant for a man twice her size and was doing absolutely nothing at this point because it was soaked clean through. And then he saw the baby. It was alive. He could see the tiny chest moving, barely but definitely moving. The child's face turned toward its mother's side like even in sleep it was trying to find the warmest thing. Someone had wrapped the infant in what looked like a wool scarf, and then wrapped that in the sleeve of a second coat that had been cut or torn away from the main garment. Whoever had done that, and Caleb understood with a slow, terrible clarity that it had been her, this half-frozen woman on the floor, had used the last of their own warmth to add one more layer between the cold and the child. He put 2 fingers against the woman's throat. A pulse. Faint. Present. He didn't think after that. Thinking was a luxury. He pulled off his outer coat without hesitating, wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, tucked it underneath her the best he could. He picked up the baby first, careful, like he was handling something that could shatter, and held it against his chest with one arm. Then he got the woman up. She was limp, completely unresponsive, which made her heavier than she looked. He got her over his shoulder the way you carry a calf you're pulling from a drift, and he walked back out into the storm. The rope. He found the rope with his free hand and he followed it. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel much of anything, actually, except the weight of the woman on his shoulder and the impossible fragility of the child against his chest, and something that might have been urgency but was too quiet and too focused to be called panic. It was more like the feeling he got when a fence line broke during a cattle run. The absolute clarity that comes when the only option is to act and act now and sort out the feelings later. Later never really came, with Caleb. That was the truth of it. Later had been building up for 4 years, and he didn't know it yet. He got them inside. The house was warm by barn standards, which wasn't saying much. He'd banked the fire before he went out, but hadn't anticipated being gone long, and the main room had cooled considerably. He put the woman on the floor near the fireplace. The settee was too narrow, and he was afraid she'd roll off. And he put the baby on top of her, on her chest, and then he went to work on the fire like it owed him something. Within 10 minutes, he had it roaring. Within 20, he was doing things he hadn't done since the time he didn't let himself think about. Wringing out wet clothing, checking fingers and toes for the grayish-white color that meant frostbite had already made decisions, heating water in the kettle, and then filling a bottle wrapped in a towel to lay against the woman's feet. His hands remembered how to do these things, even though his mind had very deliberately tried to forget. The baby woke up first. It happened at maybe the half-hour mark. A small, reedy cry, barely louder than a mouse, but in the silence of that house it was enormous. Caleb startled so hard he nearly knocked the kettle off the hook. He turned and looked at the child, and the child looked back at him with the enormous, unfocused eyes of the very young, and then cried again, louder this time. "All right," Caleb said, to a baby. In a house he hadn't spoken aloud in 6 days. His voice came out rough and strange, like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long while. He picked the baby up. It immediately stopped crying, just stopped, like a lamp turned down, and stared at him with an expression that couldn't possibly be called anything other than curious. Caleb held it at arm's length for a moment, examining the situation. The baby examined him back. "You're all right," he said, though he wasn't certain yet whether this was true. He pulled the child closer, checked its fingers. All present, color returning, no damage that he could see. And then, because there was nowhere else logical to put it, and the floor was cold even near the fire, he ended up sitting in his chair with the baby against his chest, one hand cupped over its back, the other on his knee. He sat there for a long time, watching the woman breathe. She didn't wake that night. She slept the deep, falling sleep of someone whose body has declared an emergency and locked the doors. Color came back to her face gradually, first to her nose and cheeks, then to her lips, then to her hands where he'd managed to strip off her soaked gloves. Her breathing steadied. He checked it every 15 minutes, sitting up in the chair and leaning forward to watch her chest rise and fall. The baby slept against him. It was Caleb would never say this to another living soul. Not once. Not ever. Warm. Not just physically. The weight of it against his chest. The small unconscious trust of it. The way it made tiny sounds against his collar that weren't quite words and weren't quite not. It was the most profoundly uncomfortable feeling he'd had in years. Uncomfortable because it wasn't unpleasant. Because some part of him that he'd thought was dead or at least buried noticed every single second of it. He pushed that part back down. He was good at that. Toward morning, the woman stirred. She came back to consciousness the hard way, the way people do when they've been very far away. Surfacing and sinking, surfacing again, her face moving through expressions that had nothing to do with where she actually was. She said something that Caleb couldn't make out. Then clearer. Lily. The baby's fine, Caleb said. Her eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling, then turned her head and looked at him. And for a moment her face held an expression he recognized. Not fear, exactly, but the suspended state before fear, when the mind is still calculating whether to be afraid. She took in the fireplace, the walls, the lantern on the mantel. Her gaze dropped to the baby on his chest, and something in her face let go of something it had been holding very hard. She's all right, he said again. The woman closed her eyes. 2 tears ran sideways across her temples and disappeared into her hair. She didn't make a sound. Just those 2 tears, quiet and private, like she'd had a great deal of practice at crying without being noticed. You're at the Whitmore Ranch, Caleb said, because it seemed like the relevant information. 8 miles north of the Hargrove Post. You're safe. She opened her eyes again. How long? I found you about 4 hours ago. You were in my barn. I know. Her voice was barely a sound. I'm sorry. I couldn't go any further. A pause. I thought the hay would be warmer. It was, he said. Probably the only reason you're alive. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, I'm Eliza Warren. Caleb Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore. She stopped, swallowed, started again. I don't have anything to give you. Didn't ask for anything. I know. Another pause. I want you to know that I know. He nodded. He didn't tell her that he didn't need to know. He didn't tell her that the only thing he'd wanted for the last 4 years was to be left alone, and that she and her child had arrived and complicated that significantly, and that he hadn't yet decided how he felt about the complication. He didn't tell her any of that because it would have been unkind, and Caleb Whitmore was a great many things, but he had never managed to be deliberately unkind. What he said was, "There's a room at the back. When you can stand, I'll take you there." She nodded, like this was a negotiation she didn't have the energy to counter. She fell back asleep 3 minutes later. He sat in his chair. Outside, the storm was still going, but it had shifted. Less violent now, more settled, the kind of winter cold that meant it planned to stay a while. He listened to it. He listened to the fire. He listened to Eliza Warren breathe on his floor, and Lily Whitmore. No, not Lily Whitmore. That wasn't her name. That wasn't anything he should be calling her. He listened to the baby make small sounds against his chest. He thought about what it meant to find 2 people nearly dead in your barn. He thought about what it meant that he hadn't hesitated, hadn't calculated, hadn't done anything except go to them. He thought about the nursery at the back of the house, the door he kept locked, the room he hadn't entered since a time he didn't think about. He thought about how, for just a moment when he'd picked up the baby in the barn, he'd felt something that he'd been absolutely certain he'd buried so deep it would never see light again. He didn't let himself finish the thought. He sat with the baby and watched the fire and waited for morning. And he told himself that when the storm broke, he'd help them get to wherever they were going, and that would be the end of it. A practical matter. A human decency. Nothing more. He believed this the way a man believes something he needs to be true. The fire burned. The storm howled. And Eliza Warren slept on the floor of his house, and Lily slept on his chest, and Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 4 years building a life specifically designed to need no one, sat in the chair he always sat in the house he'd always lived in alone, and felt the world shift quietly beneath him like ice beginning to give way in spring. He didn't know then how completely it would break open, but part of him, the part he couldn't quite manage to bury, was already listening. She was up before he was. That was the first thing that surprised him. Caleb had spent 4 years waking before dawn as a matter of habit and necessity, And in all that time, he had never once come downstairs to find someone already in his kitchen. But on the second morning after the storm, the first morning Eliza could stand without holding the wall, he came down the stairs to the smell of coffee and found her at his stove with her back to him, stirring something in the cast iron pot he used for everything from beans to boot waterproofing. Lily was on the floor nearby, propped against a folded blanket, watching a wooden spoon that Eliza must have given her. The baby wasn't crying. She was examining the spoon with the intense, slightly alarmed concentration of someone who has just discovered that the world contains objects. Caleb stopped on the bottom step. Eliza heard him. She didn't turn around. "There were oats in the tin by the window," she said, "and some dried apples. I hope that's all right." "It's your food too," he said, though he hadn't quite meant to say it that way. She did turn then, briefly, and he caught an expression on her face that he couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude exactly, something older than gratitude, something that had already been through gratitude and come out the other side. She turned back to the stove. "Coffee's ready." He sat at the table. She poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of him, then went back to the oats. He watched her move and was struck, not for the first time, by the particular economy of someone who had learned to work without wasting anything. She didn't cross the kitchen twice if once would do. She didn't set down anything she'd need to pick up again. There was no performance to it, just efficiency, worn smooth by long practice. "How are your hands?" he asked. She held one out, turned it over. The tips of 2 fingers on her right hand were still an angry pink where the cold had gotten serious, but the color was coming back right. "Tender," she said. "Better. You should keep them dry today." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the idea of one, passing through and not quite landing. "I'll try." They ate breakfast mostly in silence. Lily dropped the spoon and looked at it on the floor with an expression of genuine philosophical despair. Caleb picked it up without thinking, wiped it on his shirt, and handed it back to her. Eliza watched this happen and said nothing. Lily grabbed the spoon and immediately put the wrong end in her mouth. "How old is she?" Caleb said. Not quite a question. 7 months? 8 by the end of January. Eliza looked at her daughter with the particular expression parents had that Caleb recognized and could not name. "She's been good. Better than she has any right to be, given the last 2 weeks. You were out in this for 2 weeks?" Eliza set down her spoon. 15 days. She said it flatly, like reading a number off a ledger. "We were with a wagon group heading north, 6 families. We were 4 days out of Billings when Lily got a cough, and I started running a fever. Not bad. Not bad enough to stop, I thought. But the Hartwell family, they were leading the group. Their wagon was first. They said I was a risk. That if it spread to the children..." She stopped, started again. "They voted. That's what Mr. Hartwell called it. They voted on whether to leave me behind." Caleb looked at her. 4-2, she said. That's how it went. 4 families agreed with him. 2 didn't, but 4 was enough. The fire in the stove made a sound like a small, contained explosion. Caleb put his coffee cup down carefully, because if he wasn't careful with his hands, right, then he would do something with them he'd regret. "They left you," he said. Not a question this time either. "They gave me a day's worth of food and pointed me south." She picked her spoon back up. "Mr. Hartwell said there was a trading post 8 miles south. Said I could resupply there and wait for the next group through." Her mouth pressed together for a moment. "There was no trading post 8 miles south. I walked 20 miles south and found nothing but a burned-out claim with no roof and a dead horse." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "I'm sorry," he finally said, because it needed to be said even though it was entirely inadequate. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Eliza said. "I know, I said it anyway." She looked at him then, a real look, the kind that actually takes a person in rather than just checking their face for information. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softened exactly, more like a door opened an inch to see who was knocking before deciding whether to open it further. "The Addisons," she said, "James and Ruth Addison. They were the 2 families that voted no." Ruth cried. She paused. "I thought about that a lot while I was walking, that she cried, like her crying was supposed to help." "Did it?" Eliza considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said, "but it meant something, I suppose. that she felt bad about it. She went back to her oats. Though feeling bad and doing something about it are two entirely different things. Caleb had no argument with that. After breakfast, when Eliza had cleaned the dishes, she insisted, and he didn't fight her on it because he could see she needed the small dignity of it. He went out to the barn to check on the horses and assess whatever damage the storm had done. The cold outside was severe but static, the particular stillness that follows a storm that's blown itself out. The sky was the color of old tin. His breath came in clouds. I was checking the left wall, the one he'd gone out to check when he found her, when he heard the barn door and turned around. Eliza was standing in the doorway with Lily bundled against her front, held in place by a length of cloth she'd fashioned into a carrier. She was wearing his extra coat, the brown one he'd put on the chair in her room, and she had her hair pinned up, and she looked considerably more like a person and considerably less like someone recently recovered from nearly dying. "I'm not made of glass," she said, apparently in response to whatever was on his face. "I didn't say you were." "You were about to." She came in and looked around at the barn with the same economy of observation she applied to everything. Her eyes moved over the stall walls, the water trough, the places where the storm had forced snow through gaps in the boards. "What needs doing?" Caleb opened his mouth to tell her nothing, that she should go back inside, that she'd been half frozen 48 hours ago. He looked at her face. He closed his mouth. "There's a gap in the east wall that's going to be trouble if the temperature drops another 10 degrees, he said. "I've got boards. The nails are in the tin box on the middle shelf." She found the tin box without being told twice. They worked for 2 hours, which was about an hour and a half longer than Caleb had planned to work that morning. Eliza handed him boards, held them in place while he drove nails, and directed his attention to 2 other gaps he'd missed when she found them by tracing drafts with her bare hand. Lily, strapped to her front, slept through all of it except for a period of about 20 minutes when she woke up and watched the proceedings with great interest before apparently deciding that construction work was less fascinating than she'd hoped and going back to sleep. Caleb nailed the last board. "You've done this before," he said. Eliza laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was not what he expected, not polished or careful. A real laugh, a slightly tired one, with something almost rueful in it. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "You learn or you don't eat. I learned." She rubbed her hands together against the cold. "My father used to say a woman who couldn't fix a fence was only half a hand." "Your father sounds practical." "He was." A pause. "He's gone. 4 years now." She said it the way people said things they'd already grieved fully, not without feeling, but with the feeling organized. "My mother's in Columbus. She's—" Another pause, longer. "We don't speak. It's complicated." Caleb didn't ask about complicated. He knew about complicated. He knew about it the way you know about a room in your own house that you don't go into. You're aware of it every day. You know exactly where the door is, and you keep walking past. That afternoon, Doyle and Pockets came back. Caleb heard the horses first, then voices. Doyle's deep rumble and the kids' higher pitch as they came up from the south road, arguing about something trivial in the way men who've been cooped up together for 3 days argued about trivial things. He went out to meet them, and both of them pulled up short when they saw Eliza in the doorway behind him, Lily on her hip. Doyle was 52 years old, built like a man who'd been compressed by repeated exposure to hard work. With a gray beard he trimmed approximately twice a year whether it needed it or not. He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb, then back at Eliza. "Well," he said. "She was in the barn," Caleb said. "Storm. I'll explain later." "Right," said Doyle, in the tone of a man who understood that this explanation would be worth waiting for. Pockets, whose actual name was Samuel Price, a fact known to all and used by none, was 19 years old and had the kind of face that showed everything that went through his head approximately half a second before he could control it. He looked at Eliza, then at Lily, then at Caleb, and his face went through surprise, delight, awkwardness, and a desperate effort at professionalism in about 3 seconds. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." "Mr. Price," Eliza said, because Caleb had apparently mentioned names at some point she'd registered. Pockets looked startled that she knew it. He glanced at Caleb like Caleb had done something remarkable. Doyle got down from his horse and handed the reins to Pockets without looking at him, still looking at Caleb. "You feed them?" he asked. "I know how to take care of people, Doyle." That's actually the first time I've heard you say that. Caleb decided to have this argument later. He took Doyle's horse and led both animals into the barn, and Doyle followed him in and closed the door. Tell me, Doyle said. Caleb told him. Not all of it. Not the part about sitting up all night with the baby. Not the part about what he'd felt when he picked her up in the barn. Just the facts. Found a woman and infant in the barn during the storm, near frozen, brought them in, both recovered. Her wagon group had abandoned her. Doyle listened to all of this with his arms crossed, and his expression doing nothing in particular, which was Doyle's way of listening to things he had strong feelings about. Abandoned her, Doyle repeated when Caleb finished. Voted on it, apparently. Voted. Doyle made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The Hartwells? I've heard of a Hartwell family, from Billings. She didn't say which direction they came from. Doesn't matter which direction. Doyle uncrossed his arms. Where's she going? Caleb was quiet for a moment. She mentioned family, north somewhere. Mentioned. That's what I said. Doyle looked at him for a long time in the way that Doyle occasionally looked at him, like he was reading something printed in very small type. Then he picked up a brush and started working on his horse's flank, and the subject was closed, which meant it wasn't closed at all, but that Doyle had decided to let it breathe for a while. The days that followed settled into a pattern that Caleb hadn't anticipated and didn't quite know how to object to. Eliza woke early. She made coffee. She didn't ask what needed doing. She looked around and found it. The first time she reorganized his storage shelves, not rearranging for aesthetics but actually improving the system, moving things by frequency of use, he noticed it and said nothing. The second time she mended a tear in the horse blanket he'd been meaning to get to for a month. He noticed that too. The third time she had pockets cutting wood in a pattern that produced less waste, and he couldn't figure out how she'd taught the kid something in 20 minutes that he'd been trying to show him for 6 months. He started to say something and then changed his mind. Doyle caught him changing his mind. Doyle said nothing. Doyle started smiling at things that weren't obviously funny, which was worse. The real complication was Lily. Lily was 7 months old and had apparently decided, somewhere in the first week, that Caleb Whitmore was one of the more interesting things in her world. This was both unearned and inconvenient. He had done nothing to court her interest beyond picking her up when she dropped the spoon, and occasionally, when there was no reasonable alternative, holding her while Eliza worked at something requiring both hands. But Lily had made a decision. She watched him. Across rooms, around corners, through the bars of the cot he'd fashioned from 2 boards and a piece of canvas. She tracked him with the patient, unblinking focus of someone gathering information. The first time she reached for him, one small hand extended toward him from Eliza's arms, fingers opening and closing in the gesture of infants that means come here with an urgency that brooks no argument. He took an actual step back before he caught himself. Eliza watched this happen. You can say no, Eliza said without judgment. She's not going to remember. It's fine, Caleb said, which was not exactly true, and took the baby because the alternative was explaining why he wouldn't, and he didn't have words for that yet. He wasn't sure he ever would. Lily grabbed the collar of his shirt and pulled it sideways, apparently just to see if she could. She could. She seemed satisfied with this discovery. He carried her for 20 minutes while Eliza tried to repair a buckle on the harness he'd asked her to leave alone. And in that 20 minutes, Lily fell asleep against his shoulder with one fist curled in his shirt, and her face tipped toward his neck, and he stood very still next to the window and looked out at the snow-covered land and felt something rearranging itself in his chest, quietly, without his permission. He didn't like it. He liked it entirely too much. Both things were equally true, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing that had happened to him in 4 years, in a 4-year stretch that had contained several genuinely unsettling things. He put her down in the cot before Eliza finished the buckle. 11 days after the storm, the weather broke enough for a clear road south, and Doyle came in from checking the south fence and reported that the Hargrove Post Road was passable. He said it at dinner, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man making a neutral observation about weather. He did not look at Caleb. He did not look at Eliza. He ate his beans with great concentration. The silence at the table lasted approximately 4 seconds. I'll need to start getting organized, Eliza said, to her plate. There's no rush, Caleb said, meaning, he realized immediately, quite a lot more than the words. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. It was the kind of moment that had several things in it, none of which were going to be said out loud at a table with Doyle and Pockets present, so both of them simply looked away. Pockets opened his mouth. Doyle put a hand on the kid's arm without looking at him, and Pockets closed his mouth. That night, Caleb sat in his chair by the fire after everyone else had gone to bed, and he thought about roads. He was good at not thinking about things. He'd built an entire life around not thinking about specific things, and the machinery of it was reliable and well-maintained. He didn't think about his wife. He didn't think about the baby boy who had arrived in November 3 years ago and left by December, too small and too early and too fragile for a world that didn't bend for fragility. He didn't think about the nursery at the back of the house, where the walls were painted the pale yellow he and Margaret had argued pleasantly about for a whole summer, where a crib sat under a window that he kept the curtain drawn on. He didn't think about any of it. He thought about Eliza Warren saying 4-2 in that flat ledger voice. He thought about her walking 20 miles south through snow with a baby strapped to her front and finding a burned-out claim with no roof and a dead horse. He thought about what it had taken to keep walking after that, to keep looking for a barn, for a wall, for any shelter that might keep the cold off the child for one more night. He thought about what it meant to be that kind of stubborn, not the loud kind, not the kind that argued and fought, the quiet kind, the kind that just kept going, kept moving, kept finding what needed doing and doing it without being asked. Margaret had been like that. He stopped that thought before it went anywhere. He went to bed. He lay awake for an hour. In the morning, he got up and did not say anything about roads or traveling or the South Post or any of it, and neither did Eliza, and the day went on. But something had changed in the quality of the silence between them. Before, it had been the neutral silence of strangers sharing space. Now it was the more complicated silence of people who have things to say and are deciding, slowly and separately, and with a great deal of caution, whether they are going to say them. Eliza had begun to teach Pockets to read. This was not something anyone had asked for or arranged. Caleb had simply come in from the fence line one afternoon to find them at the kitchen table with a Bible, Eliza's Bible, he noted, not his. He didn't own one. And Pockets bent over the page with his finger under a word, his lips moving, his face wearing the particular tight expression of someone fighting very hard to understand something. Caleb watched from the doorway. Pockets got the word. His face changed completely, cracked open into a grin so wide it was almost embarrassing. "There," he said. "There," Eliza confirmed. "I read that." "You did." Pockets looked up, apparently to tell someone, and found Caleb in the doorway. His grin didn't dim. "Mr. Whitmore, I read that." Caleb looked at the page and then at Pockets. "You did," he said, in the same tone Eliza had used. He went and hung up his coat. Later that evening, when Pockets had gone out to close up the barn, and Doyle was somewhere doing whatever Doyle did in the evenings, Caleb had honestly never inquired. Eliza was at the table still, writing something in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. Caleb sat across from her and did not read, because he had picked up the almanac and put it down 3 times without opening it. She didn't look up. "You can ask," she said. "Ask what?" "Whatever you've been trying not to ask for the last 10 minutes. Caleb put the almanac down for the 4th time. "You're good with him," he said. "The kid. He's quick. He just never had anyone slow down enough to show him." She paused her writing, but didn't look up. "That happens to people. They come out of it all right, mostly, if someone stops and shows them." He thought this might be about more than Pockets. "Who showed you?" he asked. She did look up then, held his gaze for a moment. "My father," she said, until he couldn't anymore. She went back to her writing. "Then nobody for a while. Then I figured out I could show myself." A short pause. "It's harder that way. But it works." Caleb sat with that. The fire was lower than he usually let it get. He got up and put 2 more logs on it, and when he came back to the table, he didn't sit down right away. He stood for a moment, one hand on the back of the chair. "The family you're going to," he said. "North." She stopped writing. "Where exactly?" he asked. The pause before she answered was 1 second too long, a second that said something she wasn't going to say out loud. "My cousin's husband," she said. "Outside of Great Falls. He runs a mercantile." "You have a letter from them? An arrangement?" Another pause. "Eliza." She set down her pen. She looked at the page in front of her for a moment, then closed the book. Her hands were flat on the table. I wrote to them, she said carefully, in October, before we left. I explained the situation. Did they write back? She didn't answer. Did they write back? He said again, not loud, not accusing, just asking. No, she said, and then quieter. But they might not have received it. The mail was slow. The weather... She stopped. They might not have received it. Caleb sat back down. He looked at her, and she looked at the closed book in front of her, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that October was 3 months ago, and if there was an arrangement to be made, it would have been made. The road to Great Falls in February, Caleb said finally, is not a road I'd send anyone on with an 8-month-old baby. I know. I'm not saying you can't go. He watched her face. I'm saying it's not safe. She looked up. Her eyes were dry and steady and held a kind of tired dignity that he recognized as the face a person put on when they'd already had the argument with themselves and lost, and were now just dealing with the outcome. I'm not your problem to manage, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Caleb, he said. She blinked. Stop calling me Mr. Whitmore. You've been in my house for 2 weeks. My name is Caleb. She looked at him for a long moment. Caleb, she said, like she was testing the weight of it. I'm not your responsibility. No, he agreed. But you're here, and Lily's here. And it's February, and the road to Great Falls won't clear until March at the earliest. He picked up the almanac finally, and opened it to nothing in particular. So there's no decision to make right now. She watched him for a moment. He turned a page he hadn't read. Thank you, she said. I didn't do anything. I know. She opened her own book again. I said it anyway. He looked up. She was already writing. Something that had been very carefully braced for a long time shifted in his chest, the way a beam shifts when you take the weight off it. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a small fundamental change in where the pressure was sitting. He turned another page. Outside, the Montana winter held everything it had claimed in its grip, enormous and indifferent and absolute. Inside, the fire burned and Lily slept in her cot with her fist in her mouth, and Eliza Warren wrote in her small book, and Caleb Whitmore read an almanac he wasn't reading, and the house that had been silent for 4 years held all of it without collapsing. It was the most ordinary evening he could imagine. He didn't know why his hands were unsteady when he turned the next page. He told himself it was the cold. He'd been telling himself things like that for a long time. He was very practiced at it. He could keep doing it for as long as necessary. But in the room at the back of the house, behind the locked door, the curtain over the pale yellow window moved slightly in a draft from nowhere, like something reminding itself it was still there. And Caleb Whitmore turned another page and said nothing, and felt, despite everything, like a man who was still, against all reasonable odds, alive. March came in like an argument nobody wanted to have. The snow didn't melt so much as it surrendered, pulling back from the fence lines and south-facing slopes in patches, leaving behind ground that was soft and treacherous underfoot. The road south cleared first, as it always did, then the east road. Then, slowly, the longer northwest route that eventually connected to the main corridor toward Great Falls. Caleb knew this because he'd checked it, twice. On separate days, riding out to the point where the road crested the ridge and became visible for 2 miles in either direction, looking at the surface, assessing the depth of the remaining drifts, calculating the conditions with the eye of a man who had spent 20 years reading this particular landscape. He had not told Eliza the results of these assessments. He was aware this was not his best behavior. Doyle was also aware. Doyle had been aware for some time, in the way Doyle was aware of most things, quietly, completely, and without comment until the moment comment became unavoidable. That moment arrived on a Tuesday morning when Caleb came back from his second road assessment and found Doyle leaning on the corral fence, apparently doing nothing, which meant he was waiting. Northwest Road's passable, Doyle said, without turning around. Mostly, Caleb said. He dismounted. You told her that? Caleb ran up his stirrups. Not yet. Doyle turned around. He looked at Caleb the way he looked at broken equipment. Not with judgment, exactly, but with the professional assessment of something that needed attention before it caused a bigger problem. She's been here 2 months, Caleb. I know how long she's been here. She's not asking to leave. You notice that? Caleb pulled the saddle. She's got nowhere certain to go. She'd tell you that herself. She's got nowhere certain to go, Doyle repeated slowly, like he was checking the meaning of each word individually. And you've got a house with a room nobody uses and 2 ranch hands who've gotten used to eating something other than your biscuits. He paused. I'm just making observations. Make them somewhere else. Doyle pushed off the fence. You know what your problem is? I'm certain you're going to tell me. You're waiting for someone to give you permission. He headed toward the barn. Nobody's going to give you permission, Caleb. That's not how it works. He went inside. Caleb stood in the corral with the saddle in his arms and looked at the house and thought about permission and what it meant and who he would have needed to ask for it. And then he carried the saddle inside and didn't think about it anymore, or tried not to. The truth was that the house had changed in ways he felt in his body before he could articulate them in his mind. It wasn't just the smell of real cooking or the sound of Lily making her commentary on the world from whatever surface she'd been placed on. It was more structural than that. It was the way he now had reasons to come inside at specific times instead of drifting in when the work ran out. It was the way he paused before saying things now because there was someone to say them to who would actually respond. It was the way he'd started noticing, with a kind of involuntary attention he couldn't shut off, the specific way Eliza laughed when Pocket said something earnest and foolish, not unkindly, never unkindly, but with the full-body ease of someone genuinely caught off guard by amusement. He noticed things. He'd become a man who noticed things again, and he didn't entirely know how to feel about that. He told her about the road on a Thursday evening. They were in the main room, the fire going well, Lily asleep in her cot. Eliza was mending one of Pockets' shirts. The kid destroyed fabric at a rate that defied explanation. And Caleb was at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, which he'd been staring at for 30 minutes without recording a single figure. The northwest road's clear, he said. Eliza's needle paused in the fabric, just for a moment, then continued. You've checked it. Twice. When? Last week and yesterday. She was quiet for a moment. The needle moved in and out. You didn't say anything last week. No. She looked up. She held his gaze for a moment, and whatever she was thinking moved through her face in a way he couldn't fully read. Not quite hurt, not quite understanding, something in between. Why? She asked. Caleb looked at the ledger. I wanted to be certain, he said, which was true but was also not the complete truth, and he suspected she knew it. She seemed to decide not to press it. She set down the shirt in her lap. Great Falls, she said. I've been writing to my cousin again, since January. She hasn't written back. I know. She looked at him sharply. You check the mail yourself every time Pockets goes to the post, he said. Not an accusation, just an observation of a fact. And you come back with the same face every time. She was quiet. It's a long shot, she said finally. I know it's a long shot, but I don't have other shots. You could stay. He'd meant to build up to that. He'd had 3 different ways of approaching it that he'd gone through in his head over the past week, none of which had involved just saying it plainly like that at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night while she was mending a work shirt. But there it was. Eliza went very still. The work here is real, he said, looking at the ledger because it was easier than looking at her face. You know this property now. You know what it needs. I'd pay you wages, same as Doyle. You'd have the room. Lily would have... He stopped, organized himself. It's a practical offer. The silence lasted long enough that he finally looked up. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't categorize at all, which was unusual. He'd gotten reasonably good at reading her face over the past 2 months. This was something he hadn't seen before. Complicated. Like several things were happening in it at once. A practical offer, she said. Yes. Wages. My own room. Yes. Like a hired hand. You'd be more useful than most hired hands I've had. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up the shirt and the needle and went back to mending. He waited for more, and more didn't come. Eliza. I heard you, she said. The needle moved in and out. I'm thinking. He let her think. He looked at the ledger. He recorded 3 figures he'd been meaning to record for a week, and by the time he'd done it, she'd finished the shirt and folded it and placed it on the arm of her chair. I'll stay through spring, she said, through calving season. I can help with that. She picked up her own mending. a hem that had given out on her second dress, the dark blue one. After that, we'll see. It wasn't what he'd asked. It wasn't what he'd wanted. He recognized both of these things clearly and said nothing about either of them. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat in the quiet, and the fire burned, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was the particular silence of two people who have said approximately half of what they mean and are each privately deciding what to do with the other half. Caleb put a reasonable interpretation on this arrangement and held it for 16 days. Then a writer came from town. He was a young man Caleb vaguely recognized from the Hargrove Post, lanky, with a horse that needed its shoes attended to and a letter in his breast pocket that he handed over with the air of someone who was glad to be done with a task. Warren, the writer said. The post office held it. Figured since you were the closest registered address. I'll see she gets it, Caleb said. He looked at the letter in his hand. The return address was Great Falls. The handwriting on the front was a woman's, not Eliza's. He brought it to her in the barn, where she was brushing down the gray mare that had developed a particular fondness for her and would stand differently for Eliza than for anyone else. He held out the letter. She took it. She looked at the handwriting and something moved through her face. She opened it. He gave her privacy by turning to check the water trough, which didn't need checking. He heard the sound of the paper, then silence, then the sound of it folding back. My cousin Margaret, Eliza said. He turned around. Her voice was even. She says they can't take me in. Her husband's business there's been trouble. They've taken in another family already. They don't have room. She refolded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. She wishes me well. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket. Then she picked up the brush and went back to the mare. Caleb watched her work. Her strokes were steady, the same as before. Her shoulders were level. Whatever she was doing with what she'd just read, she was doing it somewhere he couldn't see. Eliza, he said. I knew, she said. Not defensively, just stating a fact. I've known since January, probably. I just needed to see it written. She moved around to the horse's other side. So, the spring arrangement stands, and after that we can talk about something more permanent, if you're still willing. I said I was. You said through spring. I meant more than that, and you knew it. She paused. The brush rested against the mare's flank. She didn't look at him. Yes, she said quietly. I did know it. A beat. That's why I said spring. I needed to do it in pieces. He understood that. He didn't say so. He went and found something to do on the other side of the barn and gave her the space she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. 3 days later, Lily learned to pull herself upright. It happened against the leg of the kitchen table. One moment she was on the floor, engaged in her usual work of touching everything she could reach, and the next she had both fists wrapped around the table leg and was hauling herself upward with an expression of absolute grim determination, and then she was standing, wobbly, uncertain, a tree in high wind, but standing. She looked around from her new elevation with enormous satisfaction. Caleb was at the table. He had seen it happen from 18 inches away. He sat completely still for a moment, and then he said, Look at that. Eliza turned from the stove. She saw Lily standing. Her face did something complicated and immediate that she didn't try to control. Oh, she said, soft and involuntary. And she came across the kitchen and crouched down, and Lily, distracted by her mother's arrival, let go of the table and sat down hard on the floor and looked confused about where the height had gone. She was standing, Caleb said. I saw. Eliza had both hands on Lily's face, examining her like something precious and slightly astonishing. 8 months, she said mostly to herself. You're in a hurry, aren't you? Lily grabbed Eliza's thumbs and used them to try to stand up again. Caleb watched this. He watched Eliza help the baby find her balance, both hands out, ready to catch. Not catching, but ready. He watched Lily get her feet under her and wobble and grip and hold. He thought about what Doyle had said, about permission, about nobody giving it to you. He thought about the nursery at the back of the house. He'd thought about it more in the past 2 months than he'd allowed himself to think about it in the 4 years before. Not long thoughts, not thoughts he let develop into anything. Just the awareness of the room the way you were always aware of a door in a house, regardless of whether you went near it. The door had a key. He kept it on the same ring as the barn key and the padlock for the tack box. He'd considered, more than once, moving it to a different ring so he wasn't handling it every day. He hadn't moved it. He was still thinking about this when Eliza looked up and found him looking at the door at the back of the hall. She followed his gaze. She'd noticed the door before. He'd seen her notice it the first week, and then deliberately not ask about it, with the particular tact of someone who'd been in enough other people's hard situations to recognize where questions weren't welcome. She didn't ask now either. She just looked at him, and whatever was in her expression wasn't pity. He couldn't have stood pity, but something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who also had rooms they kept locked. Lily grabbed the table leg again and commenced her vertical ambitions. The piece lasted 9 more days. Then Hartwell came. Caleb didn't know who the rider was at first, just a man on a good horse coming up the north road at a pace that said he had somewhere to be. He was watching from the porch, coffee in hand, when the rider cleared the ridge and came down the slope and got close enough to see his face. Caleb put down his coffee. Franklin Hartwell was 53 years old, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that had probably always looked older than its age and had now caught up to it. He was dressed better than a man had any business being dressed in early March, Montana, which told you something about how he thought about himself. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the property with the particular look of a man assessing what something was worth. "Whitmore," he said. Like they knew each other. They didn't. "Hartwell," Caleb said. Something shifted in the man's face. Surprised that Caleb already knew who he was, covered quickly. "Word gets around," he said. "It does." Hartwell got down from his horse. He tied up at the post without being invited to and walked toward the porch with the easy confidence of a man who'd never developed the habit of waiting for invitations. "I heard you had some company this winter," he said. "My property," Caleb said. "My business. We're looking for a woman and infant that went missing from our group in January." He said missing like a man saying a word he'd chosen very carefully. "Eliza Warren. She was traveling with us north and got separated in the storm." Caleb looked at him. "Got separated," he said. "That's right." The 2 words sat between them in the cold air. Caleb let them sit there long enough that any reasonable man would have understood what they meant, and Hartwell was apparently a reasonable man in that specific limited sense. "I'd like to speak with her," Hartwell said. "If she's here. Just to make sure she's all right, and to explain what happened." "I know what happened." Another flicker, another quick recovery. "There was a misunderstanding," Hartwell said. "About the situation. The vote. People were scared. Winter travel with a sick woman and an infant, that's a real risk to a whole group. I want to explain that to her. Make sure she understands it wasn't personal." Caleb stepped down off the porch. 1 step. He stopped there, which put him at eye level with Hartwell despite the height of the porch, which meant they were closer than Hartwell had probably expected. "She understands exactly what it was," Caleb said. Hartwell didn't step back, but something in him reconsidered. "I'd still like to speak with her directly." "Why?" A pause. "Because she's alone, and a woman alone in that situation. She's not alone." Hartwell looked at him, processing. "You taking her on as a hand?" "You need to get back on your horse," Caleb said, "and ride back down that road." The temperature between them dropped several degrees that had nothing to do with the weather. Hartwell's jaw set. He was the kind of man who didn't take direction without a fight, and the fight was moving through his face now, calculating its options. "I've got a right to speak to a woman I was responsible for." "You gave up that right in January," Caleb said, "when you put her off in the snow with a day's worth of food and a lie about a trading post." The silence was different now. Absolute. "There was a trading post," Hartwell said, but his voice had changed. "There was a burned claim," Caleb said. "No roof, dead horse. She walked 20 miles south in a blizzard with an infant because you told her to go where there was nothing." He held the man's gaze. "So when you say separated and misunderstanding, you need to understand that I know what those words are doing, and I'm going to ask you one more time to get on your horse." Hartwell stood for a moment longer. The calculation in his face ran its numbers and came to a conclusion. He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted, and he looked back at Caleb from the gate with an expression that wasn't quite anger, more like a man who'd expected a transaction and encountered something that didn't transact. "She alone with you out here," he said. "People will talk." "People can do whatever they want," Caleb said. Hartwell rode away. Caleb stood at the porch until the horse cleared the ridge and disappeared. Then he turned around and found Eliza in the doorway. She was holding Lily. She was pale. Not the pale of cold, but the pale of hearing something through a wall that you weren't certain you were supposed to hear. She'd been there long enough to catch at least part of it. "He came," she said. "He came." "What did he say?" Caleb came back up the porch steps. "Nothing worth repeating." She looked at him for a moment. Her arms were tight around Lily in the unconscious way of someone bracing for something. "He'll have connections," she said. "In town. People who know him." Her voice was careful and controlled in the particular way that meant it was costing her to make it so. "If he decides to make things difficult, he won't." Caleb held the door for her. "Come inside, it's cold." "Caleb?" "Eliza, come inside." She looked at him for another moment. Then she went in. He followed and closed the door, and that was the end of Hartwell, or at least the end of him on the property, which was the only end Caleb could guarantee. But the visit had done something, shaken something loose. That night, Eliza was quiet in a way she hadn't been in weeks. Not the productive quiet of someone working through something and coming out the other side, but the still quiet of someone sitting with a fear they'd managed to put in a box, and which had just been let out again. She put Lily to bed and came back to the main room and sat by the fire without picking up any of the small work she usually had in hand, and Caleb sat across from her and looked at the fire and let the quiet be what it was. After a while she said, "I wasn't lost?" "I know." He said, "Separated. Like it was weather. Like I wandered off." She looked at the fire. "He knocked on my wagon door at 5 in the morning. He stood there with 4 other men behind him, and he said, 'Mrs. Warren, we've decided this arrangement isn't working for the group.' That's what he said. Isn't working for the group. Like I was a leaking barrel." She paused. "Lily was coughing. I was running a fever and Lily was coughing, and he stood there and said the group had decided, and the 2 families who'd voted no, they wouldn't look at me. Not one of them looked at me." Caleb said nothing. He let her say it. "I've never told anyone that," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you've been carrying it like something you were afraid to put down," he said. "Like if you set it somewhere you'd lose track of it and it would get away from you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what it felt like." She looked back at the fire. "I'm not afraid of him," she said, and he could hear that it was mostly true. "I'm afraid of what it would mean if he has the power to, if he can decide things, like he decided before." "He doesn't have that power here," Caleb said. "You can't know that." "I can, because this is my land and my house, and I decide what happens on it. And what I've decided is that you and Lily are here, and that's how it is." He said it without heat, without performance, just the facts of the matter. "Hartwell's opinion doesn't change what I've decided." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. "Caleb," she said. "Hmm? When you offered the permanent arrangement, what did you mean by that exactly?" He was quiet for long enough that it wasn't quite a pause anymore. "I meant, I don't want you to leave," he said. "As a hand," she said, "or as something else." He finally looked at her. She was watching him with the same direct, undefended attention she'd given him that first morning over coffee. The door open an inch, waiting to see. "Something else," he said. She held his gaze. "That's—" She stopped. I don't know how to do this carefully," she said. "I've been trying to be careful because you've done something—" She stopped again and pressed her lips together, and he could see her organizing herself the way she organized everything, by function and necessity rather than feeling, except the feeling kept getting in the way. "You've done something I didn't expect," she finally said, "and I don't know what to do with that." "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't known what to do with it for 8 weeks." She almost laughed. It came out somewhere between a laugh and something else. "Is that honest?" "I don't really do anything else." She looked at the fire again. "I've been afraid," she said, that the reason it's easy to be here is because I don't have anywhere else. And I don't know if that's the same as wanting to be here." "Is there a difference?" he asked. "For you, right now?" She thought about it seriously. "I don't know," she said. "I think I need more time to know." "All right. That doesn't bother you?" He considered the question. Yes, he said, but not more than the alternative. The fire burned. Lily made a small sound from her cot and then went quiet. Outside, the wind was coming up again. Not a storm, just the usual March argument, pushing at the windows and giving up. Eliza got up and went to check on Lily, bending over the cot for a moment, and then she straightened and looked at the locked door at the back of the hall. "What's in that room?" she asked. The question landed the way it was always going to land, squarely, with full weight. He'd known it was coming since January. He'd been preparing for it since January. "A nursery," he said. She turned around slowly. "My wife and I," he said. "We lost a boy. 3 years ago, just before Christmas." He said it in the same flat ledger voice she'd used about the wagon group, and he understood now in a way he hadn't before where that voice came from, what work it was doing. "I've kept the room locked since." Eliza stood very still. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "She died that winter, the same one." Eliza came back and sat down across from him. She didn't touch him. She seemed to understand without being told that touch was not what this moment needed. She just sat close and was present in the way she was present for everything, fully and without performance. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I can tell." They sat together in the quiet, the fire, the wind, Lily breathing softly in her cot, all the ordinary sounds of a house with people in it. "The room," Eliza said very gently. "You don't have to, but does it need to stay locked?" Caleb reached into his pocket. His hand found the key ring the way it always did, by memory and habit. He felt the shape of the nursery key among the others. Small, simple, iron. He didn't take out the ring, but he held it. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded, like this was a completely reasonable answer, which it was. "When you're ready," she said. "It might be a while." "I'm here," she said. Simple as that. He held the keys in his pocket and looked at the fire, and outside the March wind made its case against the windows, and the ranch that had spent 4 years holding its breath held it a little less. He wasn't ready yet. He knew that clearly. But for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer entirely certain that ready was something he'd have to find alone. The key stayed on the ring. Caleb noticed it every morning when he picked up his coat from the hook by the door, every evening when he set it down again. The iron was smooth from years of handling, worn to the particular softness of metal that has been touched daily without ever being used. He knew its weight, the way he knew the weight of everything on that ring: barn key, tack box lock, the padlock on the root cellar. Each one had a purpose, each one got used. The nursery key just rode along. April arrived without ceremony, the way April did in Montana. Not warm, not welcoming, but grudgingly less hostile. The snow retreated to the north-facing slopes and the deep draws where the sun couldn't reach. The ground thawed enough to work in the mornings and froze back at night, which made everything twice as hard and took twice as long. Caleb didn't mind hard work. Hard work had been his primary relationship for 4 years, and it had never once let him down. What was different now was that he came in from the hard work, and there was supper on the table. Not always elaborate, not always particularly refined. Eliza cooked the way she did everything, practically and without waste, but hot and real, and set out with the assumption that he'd be hungry, which he always was. He sat across from her, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. And Lily sat between them in the chair pockets had modified with extra boards and a length of rope to make it safer, working her way through whatever Eliza had softened enough for her to manage. He had started looking forward to supper in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything since before. He didn't examine this too carefully. Caleb started looking forward to supper in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything since before, and he kept that recognition at arm's length the way you kept a fire at arm's length, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough not to get burned. The calving started in the second week of April. It was the hardest part of the ranch year, and Caleb had always managed it with just Doyle and whoever the current second hand happened to be, working in shifts through the night, because cattle didn't consult the calendar, and a first calf heifer didn't care that it was 2 in the morning and the temperature had dropped back to 20 degrees. He'd set up the pull schedule with Doyle the way he always did, dividing the nights into watches, preparing the equipment, and was heading to the barn on the first night when he found Eliza already there. She had a lantern and a pair of his old work gloves that were too large for her hands, and she was looking at the first heifer, who was already showing signs of a long night, with the expression of someone running an assessment. "Go inside," Caleb said. "She's going to need help," Eliza said. "The first one always reads wrong to them. She's been circling for 2 hours." He looked at the heifer. She was right. "You've done this before." "I told you. Farm in Ohio." She pulled the gloves tighter. "My father had cattle. I've pulled calves since I was 14. She glanced at him. "Go get Doyle if you want, but someone needs to be in here now." He got Doyle. What followed was 4 of the most exhausting weeks of any year Caleb could remember, including years that had been genuinely terrible. And what surprised him, continued to surprise him, because he hadn't finished being surprised by her, was how Eliza moved through it. Not just capable, though she was that, but steady in the specific way of someone who understood that exhaustion was a condition to be managed, not an excuse to slow down. She took the 2 to 5 watch 3 nights running when Doyle's back gave out, which it did every spring, the same vertebra every time. And she did it without complaint and without requiring acknowledgement. And on the 4th morning, when Caleb found her asleep in the barn, hay with a newborn calf tucked against her legs, he stood in the door for a moment and did not examine what he felt. He covered her with his coat and went and did the 6 o'clock feeding himself. Doyle found him in the barn an hour later, looked at the coat, said nothing, started on the water trough. "Don't," Caleb said. "I didn't say anything," Doyle said. "You were about to." "I was going to say the Henderson heifer's looking off," Doyle said with great dignity. "But if you'd rather talk about something else." Caleb worked on the water trough, and they did not talk about something else. Lily, meanwhile, had begun walking. She did it the same way she'd done everything, with absolute commitment and no regard for the physics of the situation. She would stand, take 2 steps, and then sit down hard and look at the floor with an expression of genuine grievance, as though the ground had moved specifically to inconvenience her. Then she'd stand up and try again. She fell dozens of times a day and cried for approximately 10 seconds each time before getting back up, which Caleb found himself watching with something he couldn't have put a name to without embarrassing himself. She had also developed an opinion about Caleb specifically. It was not a subtle opinion. When he came in from the barn and she was in the main room, she would navigate toward him with the determined, lurching gait of a very small person with somewhere to be. If he sat down, she used whatever part of him was accessible, a knee, a boot, the hem of his coat, to haul herself upright. If he picked her up, she grabbed his collar and examined his face with the unnerving focus of a scientist who has found an interesting specimen. He had stopped being awkward about holding her somewhere around the 3rd week of March. He couldn't have identified the exact moment. It was less a decision than a slow surrender to the fact that Lily had made a decision, and he was apparently not a party to it. He held her. She grabbed things and examined them and made pronouncements in a language entirely of her own invention. He listened to the pronouncements. Doyle witnessed this exactly once, from the barn doorway, and turned around and found something to do on the other side of the property. The thing Caleb had not prepared for came on a Tuesday in late April, toward the end of calving, when Eliza asked him if she could look at the household accounts. He said yes without thinking, because it was a reasonable request, and she'd been running the household for 3 months, and it made sense that she'd want to understand the numbers. He put the ledger on the table after supper. She looked at it for an hour while he went through the week's work list, and then she said, "You're paying Doyle too little." He looked up. "For what he does?" she said. "And how long he's been here?" She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to the column. "You've given him the same rate since 1883. That's 4 years. The cost of everything else has gone up." Caleb looked at the number. He knew the number. He'd said it. "Doyle hasn't complained." "Doyle wouldn't." She turned the ledger back. "That's not how men like Doyle work. They stay because they're loyal. They don't say anything about the money because the money isn't why they stay. And then one day, they leave because they finally did the math and realized they could do better." She looked at him. "You don't want to lose Doyle." "No." "Then fix the number." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been looking at this for an hour." "I've been thinking about it for a month," she said. "There are a few other things." She slid a piece of paper across the table. She'd been writing while he was going through the work list, and he'd assumed she was writing in her small book. "The feed order from Henderson's is a better price per pound than Garrity's. You've been ordering from Garrity for 3 years out of habit, I think." He picked up the paper. She'd listed 3 line items with the current costs and the comparative costs and the annual difference. The difference over a year is enough to cover Doyle's raise and then some, she said. She picked up her coffee. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just showing you what I saw. Caleb looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at her. She was watching him with the careful neutrality of someone who has said their piece and is genuinely prepared for any response, including dismissal. There was no calculation in it. She'd done the work because the work was there to do. You should be running this, he said. I'm not your accountant. You're better at this than I am. You're better at cattle, she said. People have different things. She drank her coffee. It's not a competition. He looked back at the paper. I'll fix Doyle's number, he said, and I'll talk to Henderson about the feed. He set the paper down. Thank you. You don't have to thank me for it. I know. He looked at her. I did it anyway. Something moved through her face, the beginning of a smile, not quite arriving, but visible in its approach. She looked down at her coffee. He looked at the ledger. The thing was, he trusted her. Not the careful, provisional trust of early acquaintance, but the solid, load-bearing kind. The kind you didn't decide to give. It just developed, the way bone density developed. Through repeated small tests until one day you looked at it and realized it would hold weight. He'd trusted Margaret like that. He'd trusted her completely, and losing her had done something to his architecture that he'd spent 4 years reinforcing with solitude and routine and the discipline of not wanting anything he couldn't guarantee. He understood that what was happening was dangerous. He understood it and kept going anyway, which told him something about himself that he was still working out. The night the door opened was a Thursday in the first week of May. Lily had been fussy for 2 days, not sick, just restless and out of sorts, in the way of babies who are working on a tooth or a growth or some interior rearrangement that hasn't announced itself yet. Eliza had been up with her the night before and was showing the particular texture of a person who was managing on less sleep than they needed and refusing to make an issue of it. Caleb took Lily after supper without being asked. He carried her through the main room while Eliza washed the dishes, walking the loose circuit he'd developed over the weeks. Window to fireplace to hallway and back. That seemed to satisfy some navigational requirement of Lily's that he'd never fully understood. She held his collar and looked around as they moved, conducting her usual silent audit of the premises. They passed the door at the back of the hall. Lily's hand, which had been gripping his collar, released it. She leaned toward the door with the sudden interest of someone who has noticed something overlooked. She patted the wood with her open palm, the way she patted things she wanted to examine further. Caleb stopped. He stood in the hallway with Lily's hand on the locked door and the key ring in his pocket, and 4 years of carefully maintained distance between himself and this specific 8 feet of space, and he stood there for a long time. He heard Eliza finish the dishes. He heard her dry her hands. He heard her footsteps, and then they stopped, and he knew without looking that she was in the hallway doorway, watching him. He didn't turn around. Lily patted the door again. Patient, interested. No understanding of what the door meant, of course. It was just a door to her, another surface in a world full of surfaces worth investigating. That was the thing about her. She had no idea what weight this door was carrying. She just thought it looked worth opening. Caleb's hand went to his pocket. The key ring was there, same as always. Small, iron, smooth from handling. You don't have to, Eliza said quietly from the hallway doorway. I know, he said. He took out the ring. He found the key. His hands were steadier than he expected, or maybe steadier than he deserved. He put the key in the lock and turned it, and the door swung inward on hinges that protested slightly from 4 years of disuse. The room was dark. He couldn't see much from the hallway. He stood in the doorway. Lily leaned forward again, craning to look in. The smell of the room was the smell of a place that has been closed too long. Not bad, just still, unchanged. Like time had simply stopped inside this door while it kept moving everywhere else in the house. The curtain on the window was exactly as he'd left it. The crib was against the far wall, the way he and Margaret had debated and finally agreed. Not under the window, in case of drafts, but close enough for light. There was a small chest of drawers, a chair, a braided rug Margaret had made herself over the summer, in the evenings, sitting on the porch with the dog she'd loved and he'd buried the same winter he buried everything else. He stood in the doorway. He didn't go in. Not yet. But he stood there with the door open, which was more than he'd managed in 4 years. And Lily examined what she could see with enormous interest. And from the hallway behind him, Eliza said nothing at all, which was exactly right. After a while, he stepped back and pulled the door almost closed. Not locked, just closed. He turned around. Eliza was leaning against the hallway wall, watching him with the careful, non-pressing attention she gave everything. Her face was steady and open, and she didn't try to say anything reassuring, which was the most reassuring thing she could have done. "Yellow walls," he said. She chose yellow. "It's a good color for a room," Eliza said. She was very certain about it. He looked at the door. "I kept telling her it was too bright. She said I had no eye for color." He paused. She was right. Eliza waited. "Her name was Margaret Elaine Whitmore," he said. She laughed at everything. Not the social kind of laughing, but really laughed. At things that were actually funny. She had no patience for things that weren't worth doing, and she told you so, and somehow you were never offended by it. He looked at the floor. She would have been 31 this April. Lily had gone quiet against his chest, picking up some change in the air around him the way babies did. "The boy," he said. "We didn't name him. He came too early, and we didn't get time." He stopped. "That's the part I've never been able to." He stopped again. Eliza crossed the hallway and took Lily from him without asking. She held the baby against her shoulder and she touched Caleb's arm, her hand on his forearm, just briefly, just present. And she didn't say she was sorry, and she didn't say it would be all right, and she didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would make any of it different. He stood in the hallway and let the door be open, and that was the whole of what he could manage that night. But it was something. It was more than he'd managed in 4 years, which wasn't nothing. 3 days later, Doyle asked him directly. They were mending the east fence after a section collapsed under the weight of the last snow, working down the line with post-hole digger and wire. And Doyle said, without any particular preamble, "What are you doing, Caleb?" It wasn't a question. It was a request for information. "Mending fence," Caleb said. "Don't." Doyle hammered a staple into the new post. "She's been here 4 months. The spring arrangement's over. She's not going anywhere and you're not asking her to." He moved down the line. "I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying, what are you doing?" Caleb drove the next post. Hit it harder than necessary. "It's not simple." "It's not," Doyle agreed, "but it's also not as complicated as you're making it." He unrolled a length of wire. "You've been acting like if you don't name it, it isn't happening. That's not how things work, Caleb. Things happen whether you name them or not. You just lose time not naming them." Caleb worked in silence for a moment. Margaret has been gone 3 years, Doyle said, not unkindly. "You know that. You know she wouldn't want you in that house alone. She told you so herself, didn't she?" She had. He remembered the conversation. Late one night, earlier in their marriage, one of those hypothetical conversations that felt safe because they were hypothetical. She'd been characteristically direct about it. "If I go first, you'd better not rattle around in this house like a ghost. I'll come back and rattle around with you, and neither of us will get any peace." She'd been laughing when she said it. He told her she was morbid. She told him he was avoiding the point. She was usually right. "It's not that simple," he said. "Eliza Warren walked 20 miles through a blizzard with an 8-month-old baby because some coward left her in the snow," Doyle said. "She's been up all night with your cattle and teaching your kid to read and fixing your accounts. She's not a small person, Caleb. Don't treat her like a small decision." He hammered the last staple on his section. "What does Pockets think?" Caleb asked, because sometimes the kid saw things clearly precisely because he didn't know enough to complicate them. "Pockets," Doyle said gravely, "thinks you should marry her immediately, and also asks if he can be there for it." He picked up the wire reel. "He is 19. Caleb almost laughed. It came out as something compressed and reluctant. "She said she needed time." "Has she had it?" He thought about what 2 months looked like in terms of Eliza. In terms of the door she'd held open by degrees, carefully, the same way she did everything. In terms of the conversations they'd been having that weren't quite the conversation, circling it the way you circle something hot without touching it. In terms of last week, when he'd come in from the barn and she'd handed him coffee and they'd stood at the window watching the first real rain of spring fall on the property. And she'd said, "This is a good piece of land, not like a compliment, like a fact, like someone taking stock of what they had." "I think so," he said. "Then what are you waiting for?" Doyle said. Not a question, a diagnosis. Caleb drove the last post of the day and didn't answer because the answer was something he'd been working on saying for 2 months and kept not being ready to say. The rain came that evening, real rain, the kind that meant spring was final and not taking arguments. Caleb came in from closing up the barn and stood on the porch for a moment, listening to it on the roof, on the hard ground, on the fence boards. The smell of it was the smell of things starting again. He went inside. Eliza was at the table with Lily, who was working on a biscuit with the focused destruction she applied to all solid food. Eliza looked up when he came in. She read whatever was on his face. She was good at that, had always been good at that. And something in her own face settled into a certain attention, like a person who sees something coming and decides not to move away from it. Caleb hung up his coat. He turned around. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. Lily announced something to her biscuit. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that first. I don't—" He stopped, organized himself. "I'm not the man I was 10 years ago. I don't know if that's good or bad. I've spent 4 years being nobody's anything, and I don't know how much of that I can undo or how fast." He looked at her. "But I know that when I come in from the barn and you're here, I'm—" He stopped again, pushed through it. "I'm better than I was before you were here. I'm not the same as I was before, but I'm better. And I think you know what I mean, and I think maybe you feel it too, and I don't want to wait until I have better words to say it." Eliza was very still. Lily had stopped working on the biscuit. She seemed to understand something was happening in the way babies understood things. Not the content, but the shape of it. "I want you to stay," Caleb said. "Not as a hand. Not on a spring arrangement. I want—" He felt the next words the way you felt a drop before you took it. "I want us to be a family, you and Lily and me. I want to do it right, if you're willing, whatever right looks like to you, however long it takes to get there." He looked at her. "I'm asking." The room was quiet except for the rain on the roof. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table, and he could see that she was working through something. Not wavering, but being careful, the way she was always careful with important things. "You know what you're taking on," she said. Not a warning, a question. "I know you'll tell me if I'm wrong about it," he said. Something shifted in her face. She's not your burden to apologize for," he said. "She's not a condition. He looked at Lily, who was examining him with the usual frank attention. "She's already mine. I don't know when that happened, but it did." Eliza's composure did something it rarely did. It didn't break. She wasn't the kind of person whose composure broke, but it gave. Just a little. Just enough. Like pressure releasing from something that had been held too tight for too long. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and quiet and held a great deal. Caleb exhaled. Lily, apparently satisfied that the important business was concluded, returned to her biscuit. Eliza pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, lowered it. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that." "I noticed," he said. "I won't be managed." "I figured. And I'm going to keep looking at your accounts." "That's fine," he said. "You're better at them than I am." She almost laughed. It came out unsteady, which was the first time he'd heard her laugh that way. And he understood suddenly that it was trust. That particular kind of unsteady was what it sounded like when a person let themselves feel something they'd been holding back. He crossed the room. He sat down across from her at the table, close, the way you sat when the business was settled and what was left was just the being in the same place together. Lily held up a piece of biscuit and offered it to him with the generosity of someone who considers this the highest available gift. He took it. He was careful to look grateful. Eliza watched this and pressed her lips together against something that wasn't sadness. "We're going to have to tell Doyle," she said. "He already knows," Caleb said. "Does Pockets know?" "Pockets has known since January. He's not subtle." She did laugh then. The real one, the full one, the one that arrived when she wasn't quite ready for it. It filled the kitchen and went up to the ceiling, and Lily looked delighted by it and grabbed the table edge and hauled herself upright to see better. Caleb looked at the two of them in the lamplight, the rain on the roof, the fire. The accounts book open on the table beside the remnants of supper. He thought about the nursery with its yellow walls and its unlocked door, and the grief that lived there that wasn't going anywhere, but that he was no longer being required to carry alone. He thought about Doyle's question, "What are you waiting for?" He didn't have an answer to that anymore. He was done waiting. The morning after Eliza said yes, Caleb woke up at his usual hour and lay in the dark for a few minutes doing something he hadn't done in 4 years. He made plans. Not the practical plans, those he'd always made, fence schedules and feed orders, and the rotation of the south pasture. Those were easy. Those required only a pencil and a ledger and the straightforward arithmetic of a working ranch. What he made now, lying on his back in the early dark with the rain still going on the roof, were the other kind. The kind that required something more than arithmetic. The kind that asked you to believe the future was going to arrive and that it was worth building toward. He hadn't believed that for a long time. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Not entirely comfortable, new things rarely were for Caleb, but real. Solid in the way that only true things were solid. He'd spent 4 years constructing a life out of the kind of truth that kept you safe, kept you fed, kept the cattle alive through winter. That was a real kind of truth, and he wasn't dismissing it. But it wasn't the whole of it, and he'd known it wasn't the whole of it, even when he was telling himself it was enough. He got up. He made coffee. He stood at the window and watched the rain lighten and the sky go from black to gray to the pale, uncertain color that came before sunrise. And when he heard Lily's first sound from the room at the end of the hall, not crying, just announcing herself, the way she always did, like a person checking in at the start of a shift, he went and got her before Eliza woke. She was standing in the cot when he opened the door, gripping the rail, looking at him with the expression she reserved for mornings, which was the expression of someone who had slept and was now ready for the world to produce something interesting. "Morning," he said. She reached for him. He picked her up and she grabbed his collar and he carried her to the kitchen and set her on the floor near the stove, and she immediately headed for the pot rack with the focused purpose of someone with a plan. He caught her before she got there, redirected her toward the wooden spoon she'd claimed as a personal possession weeks ago and left on the low shelf he'd quietly cleared for her things. She examined the spoon to confirm it was still the same spoon. Apparently satisfied, she knocked it against the floor a few times. He made oatmeal. Eliza came in while it was still cooking, her hair not yet pinned, which she usually had done before she appeared. She stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment when she saw him at the stove and Lily on the floor. And he wasn't sure what was on his own face, but whatever was on hers was private and complete. And she went to the stove and stood beside him and looked at the pot. "You made it too thick," she said. "I always make it too thick." "I know." She took the spoon from him and stirred it. "Add water." "It's fine thick." "It's not." She held out her hand without looking at him. "Water." He got the water. They stood at the stove together, shoulders nearly touching, and he added water when she directed, and she stirred, and Lily conducted her investigation of the kitchen floor, and none of it was remarkable in any individual way, but the sum of it was something Caleb felt in the specific place in his chest, where for 4 years there had been a careful, maintained absence. Doyle came in for breakfast and looked at the two of them and at Lily, and then sat down and said, So, Caleb said. Doyle looked at Eliza. "I'm glad," he said, simply. Eliza put a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. "Thank you, Doyle." "Pockets is going to want to say something elaborate." "He usually does," Eliza said. "Prepare yourself." He picked up his spoon. "The boy practices speeches. I've heard him in the barn." Pockets came in 10 minutes later, sat down, looked at the room with the radar of a young man who had been waiting for something for months and could now see it had arrived, and opened his mouth. "Don't," Caleb said. Pockets closed his mouth. "Eat," Caleb said. Pockets ate. But he smiled at his oatmeal with such sustained intensity that eventually Doyle told him to stop it, and Pockets said he wasn't doing anything, and Doyle said he could hear him smiling, and somehow this produced the most normal breakfast Caleb could remember having in years. They were married in June. Not a large event. Caleb didn't want large and Eliza didn't need it, and the practical reality of being 8 miles from town with no family nearby on either side settled the question without much debate. Judge Aldrich came out from town. He made the ride because Doyle had done him a significant favor 2 winters ago, involving a stuck wagon and a broken axle, and the judge was a man who remembered debts. He was 60 years old and had seen enough of the territory to take most things in stride, But he looked at Caleb and Eliza standing in the main room of the ranch house with Doyle and Pockets as witnesses, and Lily on Doyle's hip examining the judge's pocket watch with focused interest, and he said, "This is a good thing," before he started the formal words, which wasn't particularly professional, but was true. Caleb wore his good coat, the dark one he'd bought in Billings 3 years ago, and worn twice. Eliza had made something. He didn't know exactly how she'd managed it. She'd been quiet about it for a month. From a bolt of blue-gray fabric she'd ordered through Hargrove's post. And it wasn't elaborate, but it was hers, made with her own hands. And when she came into the main room wearing it, Caleb stood up from the chair he'd been waiting in and didn't say anything for a moment because there was a particular problem with having spent 4 years closing yourself down, which was that when something actually moved you, you felt it everywhere at once with no dimmer switch. "Don't say it's too much," Eliza said, reading something in his silence. "I was going to say you look—" He stopped. "I was going to say something adequate, and it's not." She looked at him for a moment. Then she straightened his collar, which was fine, but she straightened it anyway, and that was the whole of what the moment needed. They stood before the judge and said the words, and Lily said something in her own language from Doyle's arms that they all chose to interpret favorably, and Pockets cried in the particular way of young men who are crying and absolutely refusing to acknowledge it, and Judge Aldrich pronounced them married and shook Caleb's hand and kissed Eliza's and accepted the glass of good whiskey Doyle had produced from somewhere and said it was the best ride he'd made out this way in years. After he was gone, after supper, after Pockets had made the speech he'd been storing up, and Doyle had endured it with the patience of a man serving time, Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch in the long June evening while the light stayed and stayed the way it did in Montana summers, like the day was reluctant to end. Lily was asleep inside. The ranch spread out in front of them, green now, genuinely green, the pastures full and the cattle visible in the south field, as shapes moving slowly against the last of the light. Caleb had built this place out of nothing, and bad years, and the particular stubbornness of a man with nowhere else to put his energy. He knew every fence line, every seasonal problem, every place where the water ran wrong in spring. He knew it the way you knew your own hands. He was aware that he was looking at it differently now. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked. "That this is the most land I've ever been proud of," he said, "and I've owned it for 11 years. She looked out at it. "It's good land." "You've said that before?" "Because it's true." She had her hands around a cup of coffee she'd brought out, though it had gone cold. "I've been thinking about the north pasture." "What about it?" "You're underusing it. If you ran a second herd, smaller, maybe a dozen head to start, the grass is there for it." She paused. "I've been running the numbers." He looked at her sideways. "You've been running ranch expansion numbers." "I run numbers when I'm thinking," she said, unapologetic. "It's how my brain works. If it bothers you—" "Eliza." He waited until she looked at him. "Show me the numbers." The corner of her mouth moved. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They sat in the evening quiet, and it was the good kind of quiet now, the kind that had things in it rather than the kind that was made of absence. Somewhere in the south pasture, a cow said something to another cow and got an answer. The horses were in for the night. The sky went from blue to the particular shade of blue that was almost green that only existed for about 20 minutes in a Montana summer evening before it went to dark. Caleb thought about the nursery. He'd been in it twice since he opened the door in April. Once by himself, in the afternoon, when the house was empty and he'd stood in the yellow room for a long time, doing nothing except standing in it and letting it be a room again, rather than a locked place where something impossible lived. Once with Eliza, who had come to find him when he didn't come for supper, and had stood in the doorway and not come in until he said she could, and had then stood beside him and looked at the pale walls and the crib and the small braided rug, and had said, quietly, she had good taste. In rugs, yes, Caleb had said. In everything else she was right too, but especially rugs. That had done something, made the room smaller somehow, in the way that rooms get smaller when you let people into them. Less enormous, less sealed. I was thinking about what to do with it. He hadn't made a decision yet. He thought he might let the decision make itself, which was not his usual approach, but seemed right for this particular thing. He thought he'd know when he knew. He thought Eliza would also know, and that they'd find it together or not at all, which was a new way for him to approach a problem but felt more honest than the alternative. He said none of this on the porch. He thought it, and the thinking was enough for now. Lily's going to walk off the porch soon, Eliza said. She's gotten faster. I found her at the far end of the garden this morning. She's 9 months old. She doesn't know that. Eliza drank the cold coffee without complaint. She thinks she's bigger than she is. Caleb considered this. She gets that honestly. Eliza looked at him. What does that mean? Nothing, he said. She narrowed her eyes. He kept his face neutral. She pointed at him. That was an observation about me. It was about Lily. It was about me using Lily as a vehicle. I married you 2 hours ago, he said. I'm not going to criticize you yet. Yet. Give it a week. She looked at him for a moment. Laughed. The full one. The uninhibited one. The one he'd been collecting since January. The way a man collected things he didn't know he was keeping until he counted them and found he had quite a few. She laughed, and the ranch evening held it, and Caleb sat in his chair and felt something that he was not going to name out loud on a porch in June because he was still, in some fundamental way, a man who did not say everything he felt. But he felt it, all of it, every particular square inch of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything. The summer was the best working summer the ranch had seen in years, which Caleb was honest enough to attribute in part to having an additional mind applied to its problems. Eliza's North Pasture numbers had been correct. They were, in his experience, always correct. And he brought in 14 head in July and ran them in the upper field where the grass had been going to waste. And by September the second herd was paying its own costs, and then some. Doyle got his raise retroactive to January, presented to him one morning with the same matter-of-fact delivery Caleb applied to most things, and Doyle had looked at the revised figure in the ledger and looked at Caleb and said, Eliza did these numbers. And Caleb said, yes, and Doyle said, tell her thank you from me. And that was the whole of that conversation. Pockets was learning to read in earnest now. Eliza had moved him past simple words into sentences, and he brought things for her to check, scraps of paper covered in his large, careful handwriting, with the earnest hope of someone who has discovered that the world contains more than he was previously equipped to access. He made mistakes, and she corrected them without ceremony, and he tried again. By August, he could get through a full page of the almanac with only occasional help. Caleb found this happening at the kitchen table one evening and stood in the doorway watching Pockets work. Through a paragraph about winter weather patterns, his lips moving, his finger moving under each line, Eliza across from him with her own work, correcting without looking up when he mispronounced something. And he thought that this was also a thing she had built in this house, this particular thing, which she had seen needed doing and done, and which nobody had asked for, and which was making a genuine difference in the life of a 19-year-old kid who would carry it forward into the rest of his life. He thought about the Hartwells. He thought about a vote of 4-2. He thought about the way some people moved through the world subtracting from it and others moved through adding, and how the difference was not always dramatic or visible, but accumulated over time into something you could finally measure. He didn't think about Hartwell much anymore in general. The man had not come back. He had apparently made calculations of his own and reached conclusions, which was the appropriate outcome. Whether he ever reckoned with what he'd done in any real way, whether the math of conscience caught up with him, Caleb couldn't know, and had stopped spending energy on. You couldn't make people accountable who didn't want to be. You could only decide what you were doing on your own land with your own time. He had decided. Lily started taking real steps in July. Not the lurching, controlled falling of earlier months, but actual walking, actual forward momentum, the business of a person going somewhere with purpose. She walked to Eliza. She walked to Caleb. She walked to the dog. Caleb had gotten a dog in June, a border collie named Patch, that Pockets had found at Hargrove's and brought back with the expression of a man not entirely sure this was allowed. And Eliza had looked at the dog and then at Caleb and said, "We have enough moving parts," and then scratched the dog's ears and allowed it to stay. And she walked to Doyle, who pretended to be indifferent and was absolutely not, and she walked to Pockets, who responded with a level of enthusiasm that could have been perceived as excessive, but was simply Pockets being Pockets. She called Caleb Da. Not Dad, not Papa, not any deliberate full word, just Da, which was either the beginning of something or the whole of what she had right now, and it arrived in early August without ceremony, without him expecting it, without anything except Lily pulling herself to standing against his boot and looking up at him and saying, "Da," with the clarity of someone stating a known fact. He looked down at her. She patted his boot. He crouched down and she grabbed his face with both hands, which she did occasionally, and which he had come to understand was her way of making certain she had your complete attention. "Da," she said again. He put his hand over her small ones on his face. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out different than he intended. Eliza was across the room and had heard it and was very busy looking at something on the shelf that required her complete attention, and her shoulders were doing something he recognized, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and Lily patted his face and then got distracted by the dog and walked away. He stayed crouched for a moment. He thought about a boy who had arrived in November and left in December, too small for the world's requirements. He thought about whether loving Lily diminished that or complicated it, or required some sort of accounting. He had spent a long time worrying about the accounting, about whether the heart's resources were finite, whether caring about a new life meant something was being taken from the old grief. He didn't think that anymore. He thought, and this was not a comfortable thought. It was not an easy thought. It was the kind of thought that arrived after a long time and landed quietly and stayed. He thought that the boy would have liked the dog. He thought the boy would have been about Lily's age now, give or take, and that he would have been learning to walk and talk and pull things off shelves and drive everyone in the house slightly out of their minds with his particular version of curiosity. He thought about the yellow room with the curtain pulled back, which is how it was now, how he'd found it one afternoon after Eliza had been in to clean and had apparently decided the curtain should come down. He'd seen it and not said anything. He'd stood in the doorway and looked at the light coming through the window onto the pale yellow walls, and it had been the cleanest pain he'd felt in 3 years, which was a different thing from no pain at all, but was also, he'd understood standing there, the beginning of the difference. In September, Eliza raised the subject of the room. She did it the way she raised most difficult subjects, directly, with prior consideration, and at a moment she'd clearly chosen on purpose, which was a Sunday evening when Doyle and Pockets were in town, and Lily was already asleep, and there was no practical business competing for the space. "The nursery," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to replace anything." "I know that too." She sat across from him with her hands on the table, not holding anything, just present. "I think Lily's going to need a room of her own," she said. "She's going to be walking confidently in another month, and she's already trying to climb the cot rail. She's going to be out of the cot by winter." She paused. "And I think it might be good for the room to have someone living in it." Caleb looked at the table. "I'm not saying forget," Eliza said. "I'm not saying paint over it. I'm saying let it be used. I'm saying let something alive be in it." She stopped. But it's your house, and it was your wife's room, and I'll do whatever you need, even if that means we build another room in the spring." He was quiet for long enough that it was a real quiet, the kind that meant something was being decided. "There's a chest of drawers," he said. "Margaret's. I'd like it to stay." "Of course," Eliza said. "And the rug." "Yes." He looked up. "I want to paint the walls." She looked at him carefully. "Different color?" "Same color," he said. "It needs a new coat. It's been 4 years." He looked back at the table. "Same yellow, just fresh." Eliza's hands on the table were very still. "Okay," she said. "And a better crib," he said. "Lily's going to demolish that one in a week. She demolishes things." "She's your daughter," Eliza said. "She comes by it honestly." He looked at her. "That's an observation about me." "It is," she said. "We're past the 1 week mark." He almost smiled. "Fair." They repainted the room on a warm Saturday in late September, just the two of them, while Doyle took Lily to the south pasture with the entirely transparent excuse of checking the fence, a fence that Caleb had checked 3 days ago and that was in perfect condition. Caleb rolled paint and Eliza cut the edges with the smaller brush, and they worked mostly in silence, the good working silence of two people who'd been working alongside each other long enough that it felt like a conversation. The room smelled of linseed oil and new paint. The walls went from the faded, lonely yellow of a room that had been closed for 4 years to the brighter, warmer yellow of a room about to be lived in. Caleb painted the last corner and stepped back and looked at it, and Eliza came and stood beside him, a streak of yellow on her left forearm, and they looked at the room together. "She would have wanted this," he said. "I think so too," Eliza said. "You didn't know her." "No, but I know what you've told me, and I know what she chose, the color, the rug, the window placement. A woman who chooses a room that carefully wants it used." She looked at the bright walls. "She wanted someone happy in here." He stood with that, the weight of it, the specific rightness of it, the way that grief and gratitude could apparently occupy the same space if you let them. "Yeah," he said, "she did." Doyle brought Lily home at noon. She came through the door with the dog at her heels and headed directly for Caleb with the determined walk she'd developed, slightly side to side, arms out for balance, entirely convinced of her own momentum. He crouched and she walked into him and grabbed his shirt and said, "Da," and smelled of fresh air in the south pasture and the particular clean smell of a baby who has been outside. He stood up with her on his hip and went and showed her the yellow room. She looked at it with great seriousness. She reached out and put her palm on the fresh paint, dry but still slightly warm from the afternoon sun on the outer wall, and looked at the color on her hand and then at the wall and then at Caleb with the expression she had when she was working something out. "Yours," he said. "This is your room." She patted the wall again. Apparently this was satisfactory. She turned her attention to the dog, who had followed them in and was examining the corner with professional interest. Caleb stood in the doorway of the yellow room with his daughter on his hip, and the afternoon light came through the clean window. And behind him in the kitchen, Eliza was making lunch and talking to Doyle about the North herd, and he could hear Pockets somewhere outside doing something with a hammer, and the dog walked out of the room and bumped against his leg on the way, and the air smelled of paint and autumn coming, and the particular ordinary complexity of a house that had people in it. He thought about the night he'd opened the barn door, not because he chose to think about it. It just arrived, the way it occasionally did, in the specific sense. Memory of cold air and lantern light and the shape of a woman on the barn floor with one arm extended. He thought about standing there for 3 full seconds, doing the arithmetic of whether to involve himself. The arithmetic that a man who has been alone and hurt does when he sees something that will require something from him. He thought about how he'd crossed the barn in 4 steps without finishing the arithmetic. He thought about what that said, about instinct and choice and the difference between them, and whether the difference mattered, and whether it was possible that the best decisions you ever made were the ones you made before you had time to talk yourself out of them. He thought about Franklin Hartwell standing at his gate doing his own kind of arithmetic. The arithmetic that put a sick woman off a wagon at 5 in the morning with a day of food and directions to nowhere. The arithmetic of group survival that forgot to account for the humans in the group. He thought about the 2 families that voted no and wouldn't look at her, and how voting no and doing nothing were apparently not so different from each other in practice. He thought about Eliza walking 20 miles south through the snow. He thought about how much you had to want to live, how much you had to want the person in your arms to live, to keep walking when you'd already found nothing, and the road ahead was exactly as promising as the road behind. That kind of stubborn, he thought, was the only kind worth having. Not the stubborn of pride or refusal, the stubborn of not yet. The stubborn of one more step, one more mile, one more barn door that might open onto warmth if you could only get there. He had opened the door. She had gotten there. Between those 2 things, all of this had become possible. Lily had fallen asleep on his shoulder, which she sometimes did in the afternoons, the abrupt, absolute sleep of small children who simply stopped where they were and went under. He felt the full weight of her settle against him, the way it always settled, like something exactly the right size for the space it occupied. He carried her into the yellow room and laid her in the new crib and stood over her for a moment. She slept with her arms out, open-handed, the way babies slept, like they weren't afraid of anything coming, like they had no reason yet to close their fists. He pulled the door partway closed and went back to the kitchen. Eliza looked up from the stove. She read his face in the way she always read it, quickly, accurately, without making a thing of it. "She's down," he said. "Good." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Doyle thinks the east well might be going soft. He wants you to look at it this week. I'll look tomorrow." I told him. She went back to the stove. "Also, I've been thinking about the chicken situation." "We don't have a chicken situation." "That's the situation," she said. "We don't have chickens. We pay Garrity 3 cents an egg. You want to get chickens? I want to run the numbers on chickens." He looked at her back, at the efficient movement of a woman who saw what needed doing and did it, who ran numbers because her brain worked that way and made no apologies, who had walked 20 miles through the snow and made oatmeal the next morning and reorganized his shelves and taught a kid to read, and stood beside him in a yellow room while he figured out how to let grief and living exist in the same space. "Run the numbers," he said. "I already did." She said it without turning around, and he could hear the almost smile in it. "It's favorable." "Of course it is." "We'd need to build a co-op. I have thoughts on the location." "I imagine you do." She turned around now, and the almost smile had arrived completely, which was, he had accumulated a significant number of observations about Eliza Whitmore's expressions over the past 9 months, and this particular one, the full and unguarded one, was still the one that did something unreasonable to his chest. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She pointed at him. "That was another observation." "I observe things," he said. "I've been told I have no eye for color. Apparently my other senses compensate. She laughed. The kitchen held it. The yellow room held it with the door partway open. The whole ranch held it, because that was what happened when a house had people in it who laughed. The building remembered it, kept it in the boards and the walls, added it to the record. Doyle came in and poured his own coffee and sat at the table and looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who was deeply satisfied with the way things had turned out, but was far too reserved to say so directly. "Chickens," Eliza said to him. "Good idea," Doyle said. "I thought so." "You always do," Doyle said. "That's why it's always a good idea." Caleb sat down with his coffee and let the kitchen be what it was: full, complicated, imperfect, ongoing. Pockets came in from outside and washed his hands and sat down and began describing a completely unnecessary amount of detail about what he'd been building, which turned out to be a birdhouse, which nobody had asked for, which was very much a Pockets thing to do. Doyle told him the birdhouse was unnecessary. Pockets explained that birds needed houses. Doyle said birds had been managing without Pockets' help for some time. Pockets said that didn't mean they wouldn't appreciate it. Eliza put food on the table. Caleb looked around at all of it. He thought about what a man was in the final accounting. Not the land he owned or the cattle he kept or the money in the Billings bank or even the work he did, which was honest work and worth something. He thought a man was what he chose to do with the moments that required something from him. Whether he crossed the barn or stayed at the door, whether he let someone in or kept the arithmetic going until the answer came out in his favor. He hadn't always gotten it right. He'd spent 4 years locked inside his own grief like it was a room he deserved to stay in, which wasn't bravery or loyalty. It was just fear wearing a different coat. Fear of caring about something again and losing it. Fear of the simple, terrible arithmetic of loving people. That they were mortal, that you were mortal, that everything you built with another person was built on a foundation that time was always working at. That was true. That was completely and entirely true. And it was also true that Lily was asleep in the yellow room with her hands open and the new paint on the walls, and Eliza was at his table in the house she had made into a home by the specific gravity of who she was. And Doyle was telling Pockets that birds had evolved specifically to not need birdhouses, and Patch was under the table hoping someone would drop something. And outside the Montana autumn was doing its slow, enormous work on the land, the aspens going gold in the draws, the air carrying that particular cold clarity that meant something was ending and something was not quite yet beginning, and right now, just right now, was its own complete and sufficient thing. He had opened a barn door in a blizzard because there was a woman on the floor and a baby beside her. And the arithmetic had not finished before his body made the decision. And here was what that had come to. Here was the whole of what that had become. He picked up his coffee cup and felt the warmth of it in his hands, and looked at the people at his table. And for the first time in 4 years, he did not feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man living. There was a difference. He'd forgotten there was a difference. It was, he understood now, one of the more important things a person could remember. That surviving and living were not the same category. That you could do one for years without touching the other, and that the distance between them was not as great as grief made it seem. It was sometimes the distance of a barn door, the distance of 4 steps across a frozen floor. The distance of saying yes when everything in you had spent years practicing how to say nothing. The distance, in the end, of simply deciding that the future was worth building toward. He had decided. He was still deciding, every morning, which was perhaps the actual nature of it. Not a single choice made once, but the same choice made in small ways every day, and the coffee he made before she woke, and the numbers he let her run, and the room he repainted the same yellow because some things were worth keeping, only fresher. And the choosing, he thought, was the whole of it. That was the thing he would not have understood 4 years ago, or 3, or even 1. The thing he understood now, not because he was wiser than he'd been, or stronger, or better. He was none of those things in any dramatic way. He was still a man who made oatmeal too thick and kept things locked longer than he should, and needed Doyle to tell him the obvious before he heard it. He was the same man in most of the ways that counted, but he had opened the door, and on the other side of it had been everything he didn't know he was still waiting for. Outside, the Montana evening came on in its slow, enormous way, the sky going through its colors over the land that ran in every direction as far as the eye could reach, the north pasture with its new herd, the east fence that might need attention, the south field where the cattle were settling for the night. And inside, the kitchen was warm and full and imperfect and ongoing, the way all the best things were.